I'm your professor, Todd Yarbrough. I'm sure we'll get to know each other more throughout the semester, but just to give you a little information about myself, I've been at Pace now for 4 years. This is starting my 4th year. I received my Ph.D. back in 2013 from the University of Tennessee. Go Vols. I was at a small liberal arts college in Michigan for about 4 years after I received my Ph.D. and then landed at Pace University, New York City campus for the last 3 years. Very happy, love my position at Pace, really appreciate the students and the ambitions they bring to the school. I think it's actually quite a special place. I think it's, it's a little bit of an unknown gem, but becoming much known. And that's through the work of fantastic students such as yourself, as well as your dedicated faculty staff and administration, maybe. Okay, so what I'm going to do in this first lecture is I'm going to kind of frame a particular environmental issue around what are going to be a lot of the broader contours of the course. Economics and the environment have very interesting relationship. It's a strained relationship, obviously. And I think, as is the case in a lot of instances where there's some problem within a system, if that system is itself important, such as an economic system, then we tend to revert to the status quo often, or at the very least, there's some general inertia which is resistant to change. And I think when we look at the economic system, and not just necessarily in the context of just the environment, but just the economic system and how it works, and issues of inequality, we can suggest that one of the problems is a reluctance to critically assess and to often fall back on the status quo. And environmental economics is very much a response to that position. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but environmental economics is one of the subdisciplines of economics, which has really caused the quote unquote mainstream view of economics to shift and to shift considerably. 40 to 50 years ago, most economists saw the environment as merely this input into a broader economic system, and the focus should, of course, be on economic growth. However, there was always a strain of economics which interested itself in environmental issues, and indeed, especially in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, there's really been an explosion of interest amongst economists to not only addressing and assessing the extent of our environmental problems, but also offering potential solutions. And so aside from the fact that, almost all of our environmental problems come from economic reasons, which is something I'll get into a little bit later on, there's also this potential that economics can play a role in the potential solutions, and certainly should be involved in the debate about how we deal with environmental issues, and be less of that counterpoint that I think oftentimes we tend to frame. You can do more for the environment, but you're going to hurt the economy, or you can do more for the economy and you're going to hurt the environment. That sort of binary dichotomy as a paradigm for how economists think about the environment doesn't really exist anymore in the mainstream. And we'll get into that certainly as the course goes on. So, why economics? What is the reason why we want to think about these issues from an economic reason? Because there's all sorts of ways that we can critically assess the issues of environmental problems. We can look at them from a social perspective and look at individual experiences. We can look at them from a political perspective. We can look at them from a scientific perspective, a biological perspective. And so why economics? Well, at the root of the environmental problems that we are most concerned with are those that spring from human decisions. There are certainly environmental quote unquote problems which are natural, that those tend to occur. However, you know, if I were to pick a particular example, let's say we're talking about ocean cliff erosion. You know, one of the big problems we have on a lot of our coastal areas is simply the fact that over time those areas will experience natural erosion. And the problem as it is that humans have decided to put economic assets on those areas which are experiencing the negative consequences of erosion. And so in that way, it makes it like seem that the problem of erosion is an economic one. We often will frame, you know, the inability of people to sell their homes if they live near erosion specific places, or even if we're talking about, you know, coastal areas in the context of climate change, right? There's always this sort of interesting focus on to what extent how are humans going to make decisions in the future? And there's often always this presumption that humans can simply move away from the environmental problems. Well, just don't put homes near cliffs which are eroding, don't put homes on waterways or at the shoreline. But of course, what this misses is that those are more environmental problems that are affecting economic assets. And instead of us critically assessing to what extent is our economic system focused on economic assets at the expense of the natural environment. So, you know, because economic consequences are rooted in human decision, and because economics manifests itself from the perspective of a behavioral science nowadays, the mainstream view of economics is very much you know, related to issues of behavioral science, especially microeconomics, which environmental economics is a subdiscipline of. Like I mentioned previously, the other problem is that economic growth, economic decisions are at the root cause of almost all the environmental problems that we have, even those, like I just said, that are not necessarily caused by human decisions, other than humans decide to put homes near erosion spots. But then, of course, you have the direct effects, you know, CO2 emissions leading to climatic destabilizing patterns, which then, of course, change economic decisions in the future, also cause a lot of cost and economic costs in the future. These are issues, of course, that we will talk about extensively. The other thing is that the environmental movement and those who have historically been concerned with the environment have often come at these problems from a fairly uneconomic way. Now, I'm not suggesting that they came at these problems in a wrong way. I'm just simply saying that economics provides an additional framework. It provides additional evidence of causes, effects, and again, potential solutions. And the other thing, and perhaps this is an unfortunate aspect of just the relative importance that people place on the economy, is that economic policy often comes first, and then environmental policy is a response to that, which is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. You know, that's maybe at the root cause of a lot of our problems, is that we sort of pick our environmental policy, and then we pick we pick our economic policy, and then we pick our environmental policy after the fact. It's again kind of that reaction. And, you know, one wonders, just from a thought experiment, what would happen if we picked our environmental policy first and then picked our economic policy in response to that. I think a lot of people would prefer that. I certainly would be someone who, at the very least, wishes that economic policy was set more in the context of environmental policy. But that sort of reactionary consequence, that environmental policy is reaction to economic policy, means that if that policy is going to be effective, it needs to understand the underlying economics of what's going on. And unfortunately, oftentimes, that has not always been the case. You know, one of the things that we will touch on sort of routinely or throughout the course is the areas in which the environmental movement, environmentalism, as it were, perhaps has a tendency to focus on not really the wrong things, but on the things that have comparatively less of a problem. You know, for example, one of the things that to those of us who research the environmental movement tends to become most prominent when there are acute forms of environmental degradation, like an oil spill, or a chemical spill, and the environmental movement is sort of thrust forward. And so as a result, environmentalists have tended to put a focus on these individual events. And those events are important, and they should be understood and assessed and prevented as much as possible. But there was a blind spot in the environmental movement which tended to take its focus off those more systemic environmental problems, for example, like CO2 emissions. This isn't to say that people weren't sounding the alarm of global climate change for a long time. It's just that within the sort of the power of the environmental movement typically came from these more acute sources, and a failure to kind of assess those more long-term systemic issues. There is an understood normative component to environmental economics, which is that we will critically assess outcomes. This is distinct from what we call in economics positivist. The positivist is sort of an assessment of how things are, and normative analysis would be an assessment of how things are and then an additional value judgment placed upon that. And environmental economics is specifically kind of at its foundation a normative jumping board, meaning that sort of economics is a fairly positivist discipline. Environmental economics is a response to the fact that it's not unfair or even really uncontroversial for us to make a normative set of analyses about the environment. One doesn't necessarily need to defend from the perspective that we should care about the environment, even for reasons that don't necessarily feed back into economic systems, just by virtue of the fact that the environment matters and that people value it. And so to say that environmental economics has a normative foundation isn't to say that environmental economics is a subjective discipline, but rather that environmental economics is a response, perhaps, to the fairly big blind spot that economics had traditionally, which was to be hyper-focused on quote-unquote positivist analysis. And so the movement into environmental economics as sort of a normative response is very important. It was the willingness of economists to say that economic outcomes, which created environmental outcomes, weren't inherently good just because they were economic outcomes, right? There was this sort of sense that amongst most mainstream economists, 50 to 100 years ago, that whatever the economic outcomes were, they were simply the product of markets. Markets are efficient. We shouldn't worry about the outcomes. That's just the market working its efficiencies out. There's been, of course, a number of innovations in economics that calls into question that perspective. Environmental economics is absolutely at the forefront of that response. The focus of this course will ultimately be much on policy. What we will often do in this course is look at specific issues of environmental problems. We will look at the policy responses, if there are any, how they're working, and if they're not, why are they not working? And then seeing if the economics of the situation helps to provide a more preferable policy response than what is currently being used. And some of this is going to come from empirical investigations of like cost-benefit analysis. Like simply, was it costlier to have one policy which, let's say, is uneconomic? And I don't mean like bad economic. I mean, it doesn't necessarily consider the economics of the situation. Like, so when the government says that a business has to reduce their emissions by a certain percentage, right? That's not really an economic decision. That's the government kind of creating a standard. And that certainly can be a potent and important form of policy if there is an emissions problem, which of course there often have been. But it is perhaps arguable that ultimately is a much costlier and even perhaps less effective policy response than, say, to tax emissions, and to put a price tag on emissions, which will naturally create incentives for firms to reduce their emissions, and also doesn't necessarily require as costly administration and monitoring that standards tend to cost. So again, we will also see where perhaps economics can use its, let's say, inherent optimization principles, specifically cost minimization, and also, to critically assess issues related to cost-benefit analysis. But we will certainly, of course, also ask ourselves if cost benefit analysis is, an appropriate way to look at this particular problem. Not everything necessarily is going to be decided by cost benefit analysis. So ultimately what we're interested in is this tension. Excuse me. What we're interested in is getting me to stop coughing. So what we're interested in is that tension between socially improving economic activity, because economic activity is good. We have a tremendous amount of research that shows economic growth is good. Education increases, infant mortality decreases, people are happier when the economy is doing well, so on and so forth. However, we know that also economic growth causes environmental damage. And so that tension is super important. And regardless of where you fall in any particular, let's call it political spectrum, as it pertains to environmental issues, it would be dishonest, I think, to not acknowledge that economic growth leads to environmental degradation. And so just because we benefit from economic growth doesn't mean that we shouldn't care about environmental degradation, even in instances where environmental degradation is purely a biological issue in the sense that it doesn't necessarily hurt humans, right? I mean, most people care that we consume water in a way that maintains its renewable aspect, right? So if we have a water table that we're drawing water from, everybody agrees we should do that in a sustainable way. Now, people may disagree about what is sustainable, but I mean, everybody says, we should consume this in a way that maintains it as a renewable resource, that we don't draw from the water table so quickly that it becomes a non-renewable resource, right? That doesn't benefit anyone. At the same time, there is always differences of opinion to the extent that we should care about, the aesthetic value of the environment. Keeping a forest as a pristine forest versus, say, cutting it down and using it to build homes or to create paper with. Those tensions are often the main source of complication and disagreement amongst individuals about how we should think about the economic system. So perhaps that is where we want to kind of keep our focus, is at those main tensions. And then, of course, policy is human choice. We choose our policies. And if policies have the ability to affect economic systems, political systems, and environmental systems, this means that outcomes are choices. Now, there is, certainly exogenous factors that we don't directly influence, right? But we know that policy does have a significant direct influence on the economy, and certainly has a direct influence on the environment. So in a way, economic outcomes, environmental outcomes are human choices. They are what we choose. And I think that's a very important point to point out, that sometimes we act like, the economy is going to do what the economy does, or the environment's going to do what the environment does. We have no, effect there. That's, we call this the big world view, which is that humans kind of exist as small components of a big world. Now, this is a fairly unpopular opinion in 2020, just by virtue of the fact that it's clear humans have a dramatic effect on local environments and of course, even global environments. At the same time, I think there is a general lack of recognition by people to say, look, outcomes are choices. If our policies can affect outcomes, then the outcomes that we see are choices, and therefore we should look at those outcomes as a potential to improve society, right?